Among roaring machines and hot oil, Frank Hughes sweeps the floor he once designed. Once he stood proud beside innovations that changed the industry, until it was all taken from him. With one termination letter, everything was stripped away. His patents stolen, his name erased. Years passed. He stayed, cleaning the same floors where his brilliance once thrived. The company's million-dollar prototype refused to start. Engineers panicked. Silence replaced hope. With anger veiled in arrogance, Chase Reynolds made his offer, $1 million in cash to whoever could fix the machine. No one moved except Frank, mop in hand, head held high. He stepped into the room that once belonged to him. One day in R&D, he said. No demands for money, just a chance to prove who he really was. That night, Frank opened old files, diagrams, notes in red ink. He knew the machine was built to fail. Every bolt he tightened was a step toward truth and revenge. Today, Frank wasn't fixing a machine. He was reclaiming his name. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Then hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next powerful story. Chapter 1. Shadow in the Factory. The rhythmic hum of machinery echoed through the vast space of Reynolds Auto Tech, vibrating through steel beams and polished floors. Sparks flared from a welding unit in the corner, casting brief glows across the high-tech interior. Robotic arms swung in precise choreography. Engineers in crisp uniforms moved swiftly with clipboards and tablets, their voices blending into the factory's mechanical chorus. And in the midst of it all, unseen and unacknowledged, pushed a yellow mop bucket. Frank Hughes moved slowly, deliberately, as if the floor held memories only he could see. His faded blue jumpsuit hung loosely on his broad shoulders, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. His hair, once coal black, was now a crown of silver. His gait carried the weight of someone who had spent decades bending over machines, first to build, then to clean after others had built upon his silence. No one looked his way. Not really. A nod here, a passing morning there, all perfunctory. To most of the young men and women at Reynolds, he was just the janitor, the old guy who knew when to stay out of their way. But this was the floor he designed. 15 years ago, Frank had stood at the heart of this same factory, though back then it bore a different name. Back then, it was Hughes Advanced Motors, a startup with bold ambition and even bolder engineering. He had built the engine layouts, reimagined the combustion sequence, rewritten what efficiency could mean. His designs were revolutionary, patents in his name, recognition from top journals, a career that promised legacy, until Chase Reynolds walked in. The merger was supposed to be a blessing, a lifeline for expansion, but buried in contracts and fine print were traps. Clauses that siphoned control, lawyers that twisted words, friends who folded under pressure. Within months, Hughes Motors disappeared. The patents, reassigned, the credit, gone. Frank's name was quietly removed from all documents. The final insult came in the form of a termination letter, followed by silence. Except Frank didn't disappear. He took a job as a contractor cleaning floors under a different badge. They didn't know who he was, or maybe they didn't care. Either way, he returned. Not out of pride, not even for revenge, at least not at first. He stayed because he had built this place, because something about walking these halls, even as a ghost, felt like defiance. So he swept and mopped and polished, year after year, and he watched. He listened. The factory changed hands. Chase Reynolds rose from heir to CEO. The faces of engineers changed like seasons. But Frank? Frank remained. This morning was no different. He moved past the assembly line where the newest prototype, the Eon V12, rested on a rotating rig. It gleamed under fluorescent light, all chrome and curves, the pride of Reynolds Auto Tech. $1 million innovation that was supposed to secure the company's future. Except it wouldn't start. Frank paused near the bay where the prototype lay dormant. A cluster of engineers hovered around it, their brows furrowed, diagnostic tools blinking red. Data streams rolled across monitors in real time. Sweat glistened on foreheads. Panic lingered at the edges of their movements. Frank didn't speak. He just watched. Quiet, invisible. System integrity, green. Fuel pressure nominal, compression perfect, muttered a young engineer in frustration. It makes no sense. Frank turned away and pushed his mop forward. But inside him, something shifted. He had seen this engine in pieces before, years ago, in drafts that bore his name. There were patterns, curves, injection timing details that only he and one other person had known. The engine had evolved, sure. But the skeleton was still his, and that meant one thing. If it wasn't working, it was never meant to. He continued mopping until the factory horn signaled the top of the hour. At that moment, the factory doors burst open, and the sound of polished shoes on concrete rang louder than the machines. Chase Reynolds strode into the room with a fury barely masked behind his tailored suit. His hair was slicked back, jaw tight, eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of a wolf guarding its territory. "Why is my prototype dead?" he snapped. Everyone froze. Frank, still holding the mop, didn't stop. But he heard everything. "I didn't fund this engine to have it stall like a lawnmower," Chase growled, slamming a clipboard off the workbench. "You have 1 day, one, and whoever can fix this thing gets $1 million. Cash murmurs broke out. Frank paused. The bucket wheels creaked to a stop. For the first time in years, his eyes didn't look down. They looked forward, and in them, a fire reignited. He didn't need the money. He needed to remember what it felt like. To be seen. Chapter 2. The Silence Before the Storm. Frank Hughes stood still as the factory floor erupted around him. Engineers whispered. Tools clattered against steel. Somewhere a forklift beeped as it reversed, its driver craning to see if Chase Reynolds was still watching. The offer had dropped like a hammer. $1 million for a solution. Not a theory, not a report. A fix by the end of the day. Frank resumed mopping slowly, but each stroke of the mop was different now. More deliberate, more rhythmic. Like ticking seconds on a clock winding towards something inevitable. It wasn't the money that got to him. It was the desperation in their voices. The same kind of desperation they used to project onto him 15 years ago when they still respected what he knew. The machine, the so-called Eon V12, was just a shell of an idea he had once nurtured. A hybrid of gas and microelectric ignition that could adapt its combustion cycle to demand. When he designed it, the concept was decades ahead of its time, but it was also dangerous, not because of fire or explosion, but because of what it exposed in the corporate food chain. Efficiency, when weaponized, could bankrupt oil partners and dissolve long-standing supply contracts. That's what made him a threat. That's why his designs were stolen and buried under new branding, safer branding, whiter branding. The clipboard slammed again. Chase was yelling at someone now, barking deadlines and threats. His voice ricocheted off the steel beams like gunshots. Frank didn't flinch. He only mopped in small circles, his mind already somewhere else. He thought about the blueprint buried deep in his old apartment closet, the one with red ink across it, his ink, marking the precise flaw they had built into the system, a timing desynchronization that would only appear under peak thermal load. It wouldn't show up on standard diagnostics. That flaw was the kill switch, the one they added after they took his name off the patents. And now it was haunting them. Poetic. The janitor walked past the break room window. Inside, a group of young techs laughed nervously, glancing at the factory floor as they sipped coffee. None of them looked at Frank. To them, he was still the ghost with a mop. But ghosts have memories. He remembered when he was one of them, back when suits came to him for answers, not coffee, back when he wore a name tag that said Chief Engineer, back when Chase was just a cocky intern with a famous last name and something to prove. Now he had everything, and Frank had a mop. But not for long. As the morning passed, failure set in. By noon, diagnostics still read green, but the engine refused to fire. Interns began pacing. Managers tapped at tablets with increasing urgency. And then, Frank did something he hadn't done in years. He stopped working. Right in the middle of the floor, he leaned the mop against the wall, stood tall, and walked toward the prototype bay. At first, no one noticed. He was just the janitor after all. Then a voice called out, mocking, uncertain. "Hey, old man, this area's restricted." Frank didn't stop. His boots echoed against the floor, louder with each step. Heads began to turn. By the time he reached the machine, the crowd had fallen into a thick, awkward silence. Engineers exchanged glances. Chase stood at the edge, arms crossed. Frank reached out, not to touch the engine, but to gesture calmly toward it. He cleared his throat. "One day," he said. His voice was gravel, but steady. It cut through the room like a blade. "One day in your R&D lab, alone. That's all I want." Someone laughed under their breath. Chase stepped forward, narrowing his eyes. "No cash?" he said with a sneer. "What's the catch?" Frank looked at him. Really looked. And Chase, for the first time in years, blinked. "No catch," Frank replied. "You'll get your engine, just give me the room." Chase hesitated. The factory waited. Then, with an arrogant chuckle, Chase waved a hand. "Fine, give the man his day. If he breaks it further, fire him. If he fixes it, hell, we'll name a hallway after him." Frank didn't react. He simply walked away, the eyes of dozens trailing behind him. And as he disappeared down the hall toward the restricted zone, a weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. He didn't smile. Not yet. But something deep inside had turned. Not vengeance. Conviction. Because Frank Hughes wasn't going to fix their machine. He was going to expose the lie they built it on. Chapter 3. Echoes in the lab. The door to Lab C hissed as it opened, letting out a cold breath of recycled air. For 15 years, Frank Hughes had passed that door almost every day, mop in hand, pretending it was just another wall. Now, he stepped through it like a man walking into his own grave, or resurrection. The room hadn't changed much. Bright overhead panels glowed sterile white, humming faintly. Stainless steel counters lined the walls, still immaculate. Rows of diagnostic stations blinked patiently. It was a place designed for ideas, not people. Frank's boots tapped against the polished floor, each step echoing louder in his ears than the hum of electronics. His hand, calloused and scarred, slid across the counter's smooth edge. He didn't need to look around to remember where everything was. He had designed the original layout himself. In a corner sat the Vortex prototype, untouched since this morning. Chase hadn't allowed anyone near it since Frank made his request. Maybe out of confidence. Maybe to humiliate him when he failed. Frank rolled up his sleeves. No one else was in the lab. That was part of the deal. One day. No interruptions. It was all he needed. From his pocket, he retrieved a folded piece of paper, creased and yellowed with time. It was the final version of his old combustion sequence schematic. He flattened it on the table, then opened a drawer and pulled out a pencil, not a stylus. The old way felt better, truer. He spent the first hour doing nothing but looking. Every wire, every sensor, every bolt. He wasn't just studying the machine, he was listening to it. Engineers called it diagnostics. He called it memory. And then he found it. A bypass circuit that shouldn't be there. Hidden beneath layers of shielding, cleverly labeled, but completely out of place. He followed the wiring, cross-referenced it with his notes. His jaw tightened. They had sabotaged it, not through brute force or sloppy rewiring, but with precision. Whoever built this had added a timing loop that would only break down after 200 cycles. Just enough to get through demos, not enough to survive long-term operation. It was genius, and it was his. Frank stepped back, breathing heavily, not from exertion, but rage. A deep, old rage. The kind that didn't come from losing a job or a title, but from watching the thing you created used to deceive the world. He stared at the engine for a long moment. Then he got to work. He dismantled the ignition casing, rewrote the calibration logic, and purged the fake error logs hidden in the software kernel. He moved like a surgeon in the operating room, every motion precise, efficient. The years hadn't dulled him. If anything, they had honed him, sharpened his focus to something almost unnatural. The silence helped. There were no managers hovering, no interns babbling, no voices questioning his process, just the sound of tools clicking into place and breath cycling through his lungs. At one point, he looked up and saw his own reflection in the lab's glass wall, older, slower, weathered. But behind that reflection, he imagined something else. A younger version of himself, standing in a crisp lab coat, eyes full of possibility. That version was gone, but not dead. Not yet. By mid-afternoon, the floor was covered in notes, sketches, and diagrams. Frank worked without a break, running on momentum and memory alone. At some point, he took out an old USB stick from his sock, hidden there since morning. He plugged it into the prototype's diagnostic port. The screen flashed blue, then green. He smiled. The real design was alive beneath the layers of sabotage. Buried, yes. Broken, no. This wasn't a fix. This was resurrection. Outside, beyond the sealed lab doors, he knew whispers were spreading. He could feel the tension rising in the walls. Chase's PR team would be preparing for either a miracle or a meltdown. The engineers, once skeptical, were probably placing bets. Let them. Frank picked up a torque wrench and moved to the heart of the engine. He tightened one bolt, then another. Every click rang out like a promise. This was no longer about proving he could fix what they ruined. It wasn't even about the engine anymore. It was about truth. And the moment it roared to life, everyone would hear it. Chapter 4. The Roar of Truth. The final bolt clicked into place. Frank paused, fingers hovering over the ignition sequence panel. The silence inside the lab was absolute, thick, electric. Hours had passed since he entered. No one had dared to interrupt. He took a breath. Not to steady himself, but to remember. 15 years ago, this was what he lived for. Not fame, not applause, just this moment. A machine on the edge of breathing, waiting to be woken. But this time, it wasn't just about innovation. This was about redemption. He pressed the ignition. The prototype hummed. Not a stutter, not a cough. A clean, low purr, smooth as silk, deeper than any engine he had ever heard in this lab. The interface flashed green. Internal diagnostics began cycling. One by one, parameters aligned. All systems stable. Frank didn't smile. Not yet. He let it run, watching the heat maps form on the monitors. No overheating, no misfire. The air-fuel ratio corrected itself in real time, exactly as he had designed 15 years ago. No more sabotage, no more fail-safes planted by corporate engineers afraid of his brilliance. This was his engine, the way it was meant to be, the way they had feared it would be. He reached into his jumpsuit and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, his original. He flipped it open, cross-checking readings with hand-drawn calculations in red ink. Everything aligned. Even the anomalies that had puzzled their senior engineers yesterday. He had accounted for them all. Behind him, the lab doors hissed. He didn't turn. He knew who it would be. "Is it running?" Chase Reynolds' voice was casual. Too casual. Frank still didn't turn. "Yes." Silence stretched behind him. Then footsteps. Slow. Careful. Frank closed the notebook and turned to face the man who had once dismantled his life. Chase looked uncomfortable in the sterile light, his designer suit out of place against the raw hum of the prototype. His jaw worked as he looked between Frank and the machine. "Well," he muttered, "you did it." Frank said nothing. "I suppose I owe you something," Chase added, hands in pockets, trying to appear unaffected. "You owe me more than you know," Frank replied quietly. Chase smirked. "What? You want a plaque on the wall? A public apology? Maybe a corner office next to mine?" Frank took a step forward. "I want access," he said. "Full access to your internal component logs, supply chains, firmware repositories. I want to know how deep the sabotage went. And I want everything that bears my signature returned to me, my patents, my designs, my name." The air shifted. Chase's face darkened. That wasn't the deal. "It is now," Frank said. "You made your offer. $1 million to fix the machine. I fixed it. Now I'm naming my price." Chase's lips tightened. "You're just a janitor." "I was," Frank said, "until today." The words hung in the air between them, final, sharp, and then the lab doors opened again. Carmen Diaz entered, one of the few engineers who had actually watched Frank work from afar. Her eyes flicked to the engine, then to the green readings on the monitor. She took a breath, stunned. "It's perfect," she whispered. Frank nodded. "It always was." More footsteps followed. Technicians, managers, engineers. The word had spread. The machine was alive. They gathered, unsure whether to celebrate or question. But they all knew one thing. None of them could do what Frank Hughes had just done. Chase stepped back, the crowd slowly swallowing him. Frank looked around at faces he had passed in silence for years. They were seeing him now. Not the mop, not the uniform, him. But this wasn't over, not even close. The machine ran, and now it would speak. Chapter 5. What the Machine Remembered. The sound of the engine echoed like a heartbeat through the factory walls, steady, alive, undeniable. For years, that prototype had sat in theory. For weeks, it had taunted every engineer that touched it. And now, under the hands of a janitor, it purred like it had never known failure. Frank stood a few feet away, arms folded. He didn't need to keep watching the monitors. He could feel the balance in the vibration, hear the clean combustion in every cycle. The prototype wasn't just running, it was thriving. Outside the lab's reinforced glass, the whispers had grown into full-blown conversations. Engineers clustered in groups, arguing in hushed voices. Some were skeptical, some were stunned, all were shaken. Chase Reynolds was nowhere to be seen, but Carmen Diaz stood silently in the corner, eyes locked on Frank. She stepped closer. "This schematic," she said softly, lifting a copy of the internal blueprint Frank had scrawled corrections onto. It's your handwriting, isn't it?" Frank didn't answer. "I ran your numbers last night," she continued. "The torque balance, the custom ignition delay, even the heat tolerance margins, they all match your design from 15 years ago." Still, Frank said nothing. "You were the lead architect of the Vortex 12. Frank turned toward her. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired, but deep inside, a fire burned. "I was," he said quietly, "until I wasn't." Carmen set the schematic down carefully, as though it were sacred. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "Because when they took it from me," Frank replied, "they didn't just take my title. They took my voice." He walked to the engine, trailing his fingers across the polished casing. "You know what happens when you accuse the company that signs your paychecks of theft? When you're black and not part of the boardroom golf club?" Carmen didn't answer. "They crush you, silently, legally, and then they sweep you off the floor, literally." A tense pause filled the room. Outside, someone knocked on the glass. A security officer, unsure whether to come in. Frank waved him away. You're the only one who stayed to watch, he said to Carmen. Why? She hesitated. Because I read the early patent filings before they were updated. I saw the names. Your name. And I've been working here long enough to know when something doesn't add up. Frank nodded, appreciation flickering in his expression. Then you understand what comes next. Carmen's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Frank reached into the side compartment of his jumpsuit and pulled out a small encrypted drive. He held it up between his fingers like a loaded weapon. This contains the original designs, the unedited blueprints, the voice memos, the emails, everything. Carmen's eyes widened. That could ruin them. I don't want to ruin them, Frank said calmly. I want the truth to live somewhere other than in my memory. Just then, a familiar voice rang out from the doorway. You need to hand that over, Frank. Chase Reynolds had returned. He walked in slowly, flanked by 2 members of corporate security, no longer smug, now careful, calculated. I knew you'd find a way to crawl out of the shadows eventually, Chase said. But you've made your point. You fixed the machine. Congratulations. But that, he pointed to the drive, doesn't belong to you. Frank's jaw clenched. It never stopped belonging to me. Chase signaled to security. He's violating IP protocols. Remove him from the premises. The guards hesitated. Carmen stepped between them. If you touch him, she said firmly, I'll call the press myself, and I'll bring every document in our archives to back him up. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably. Frank stared Chase down. You still think this is about revenge? Chase didn't respond. Frank took a step forward. It's about legacy. Mine, my father's, my students'. Every name you erased so your family could slap theirs on our work. The engine continued to hum behind him, unbothered, unstoppable. You have 2 choices, Frank said. Let the truth come out the hard way, or sign everything back and walk away with your empire still intact. The room was still. The past had returned, and it refused to be silent any longer. Chapter 6. Echoes and Evidence. Chase. Reynolds didn't move. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, more threatening somehow, like it too was waiting for his answer. Frank stood unwavering between him and the machine, holding the encrypted drive as if it were the final piece of truth in a hall built on lies. Carmen's stance hadn't softened either. Though smaller than both men, her presence commanded space. She stood close to Frank, a shield between the security team and whatever retaliation Chase was calculating behind his cold, rehearsed expression. You think you're holding power, Chase finally said, voice low and tight. But all that little drive proves is that you're willing to breach company security. Frank gave him a small, knowing look. That's what you said 15 years ago, too, isn't it? When you erased my name and buried my engine under corporate branding. You signed the NDA, Chase snapped. I signed a contract that was altered after I was escorted out like a thief, Frank replied, his voice firm now. You didn't just silence me. You sold lies to shareholders, built faulty technology on sabotaged design, and risked lives just to hold a market lead. Chase laughed dryly. You can't prove sabotage. It's just speculation. You were bitter then, and you're bitter now. I don't need speculation, Frank said. He walked to the terminal connected to the prototype and plugged in the drive. Carmen followed, jaw clenched. The screen lit up. Old files appeared, dated, time-stamped, annotated in Frank's hand. Diagrams, test logs, early designs for adaptive combustion control, and predictive wear detection. More than a decade ahead of industry standards. At the bottom of the list, Carmen saw something that made her eyes widen. A folder labeled Failsafe Loops Reynolds. Frank clicked it open. There, line after line of code, sabotage sequences, logic loops designed to degrade engine performance after a preset number of operational hours. System flags that would never trigger alarms, only gradual breakdowns masked as wear and tear. He scrolled to the signature metadata. Chase's initials, buried in the comet history, not his father's, his. "You didn't just inherit corruption," Frank said. "You perfected it." Behind them, the room had grown fuller. Engineers and supervisors had begun drifting in, some pretending to check on equipment, others watching openly now. Carmen turned and faced them. "Everyone here knows something's been wrong for years," she said. "Engines recalled, strange malfunctions, failures that shouldn't happen. This," she gestured to the screen, "this is why." Whispers turned into murmurs. Heads turned toward Chase, whose smirk had finally cracked. "You're all basing this on data from one man," Chase said quickly, addressing the growing crowd. "A man who's been bitter and invisible for years." "Then maybe it's time we stop ignoring the people we call invisible," Carmen shot back. Frank didn't flinch. He disconnected the drive and turned toward the watching eyes. 15 years ago, I trusted the wrong people. I thought the system would protect the truth. But systems protect power, and power protects itself. He handed the drive to Carmen. "I've rebuilt what I lost," he said. "But this," he glanced back at the machine, "this belongs to everyone now. Not a boardroom. Not a dynasty." Carmen took the drive like a baton in a relay. She looked around at the gathered staff, the engineers, even the janitorial team that had crept in through the back doors. "This drive will go to the media," she said. "To the patent office. To every agency that's ever audited us. If we let this die in silence, we're all complicit." Chase's facade cracked fully now. He lunged forward. "Give me that drive!" Frank stepped into his path with a calm that didn't move. "Touch her, and you'll find out what I really spent the last 15 years preparing for." Security hesitated, not out of loyalty, but uncertainty. The spell was broken. One of the guards stepped back, then the other. Carmen tucked the drive into her coat. "It's over, Chase." "No," he whispered. "It's only just beginning." He turned and walked out, his exit far quieter than his entrance, but not quiet enough to drown out the murmurs of betrayal left in his wake. Frank exhaled. The machine continued to hum. It wasn't just running now, it was speaking, and the world would hear it soon. Chapter 7. The House That Truth Built. The next morning, the Reynolds Autotech factory was a different world. Gone was the stiff hierarchy of suits and silent nods. In its place was a hum of uncertainty and whispered questions. The drive had been duplicated. Carmen had sent it to 3 major news outlets before sunrise. By 9 a.m., the headlines were already live. Whistleblower reveals sabotage and patent theft at Reynolds Autotech. Ex-engineer turned janitor uncovers corporate conspiracy. The ghost in the machine was the man who built it. Frank walked into the building the way he always did. Slow, silent, with his hands behind his back and his steps steady. But this time, eyes followed him. Not with disdain or dismissal, but with disbelief. Some nodded, some looked away, ashamed. A few gave him respectful glances they didn't know how to express in words. He didn't need any of it. He wasn't there for them. He walked straight past the main floor, down the corridor where his ID badge used to swipe green. The door was open now, courtesy of Carmen and the board's emergency vote to suspend Chase Reynolds indefinitely. Inside, the lab looked just like it did 15 years ago, except colder. New tech, sterile surfaces, no soul. Until Frank stepped in. He ran his hand along the steel counter, fingertips brushing the ghost of memories. His desk, well, what used to be his, still sat near the back. He approached it slowly. Carmen was already there, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "I wasn't sure how you took it," she said. Frank smiled faintly. "Strong, no sugar." "Of course." They sat in silence for a moment, watching technicians work behind the glass, unaware they were looking at the man who had designed half the systems they used every day. "What now?" Carmen finally asked. Frank looked around. "Now the work begins." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't just want my name back," he said. "I want the engine fixed properly. No sabotage, no hidden codes. The version I intended before they corrupted it." "And after that?" Frank sipped his coffee. "Then I build something new." Carmen smiled. "You really think they'll let you, after this storm?" "They won't have a choice," he said. "Truth is leverage, and now I have it." Just then, the door opened. A small group entered. Engineers, technicians, some interns. Young, uncertain, but curious. One of them, a woman no older than 24, stepped forward. "Mr. Hughes," she said nervously. We saw the documents. We read your notes. That adaptive engine logic. It's 10 years ahead of anything we've studied." Frank stood. "They told me my time was over," he said. "But time doesn't destroy truth. It just buries it." He looked around the room. "Now, if you're ready to dig it back up, I could use a few smart minds." The woman smiled. "We're in." More joined. A dozen engineers filled the lab within the hour. They weren't just there for a job. They came to learn, to rebuild, to finally be part of something real. And Frank, the janitor who had once swept his legacy into corners, now stood at the center again, chalk in hand, blueprints on the wall, and a new team surrounding him. Outside, the press circled like vultures. But inside, the factory finally remembered what it was built for. Not profit, not power, but progress. Frank Hughes had returned, and this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 8. Smoke and Mirrors. Frank leaned over the engine bay, sleeves rolled up, his fingers tracing the sleek contours of the prototype's power core. Around him, the newly assembled team of engineers observed in respectful silence. They had spent the last 2 days reviewing his original blueprints, learning how the energy recycling loop worked, how thermal resistance was balanced, how the engine adapted to load shifts in real time. And now, under Frank's guidance, they were finally ready to bring it to life the way it was meant to be. But progress had a cost. Outside the lab, the chaos grew louder. Journalists camped at the factory gates. Protesters and supporters clashed online. Shareholders demanded answers. Lawsuits were brewing, and Chase Reynolds had vanished. His office emptied, his phone disconnected. Inside, Frank found clarity. The sabotage wasn't just about discrediting him. It was meant to delay innovation, to force dependence on outdated, high-maintenance models that profited the old guard. The moment Frank's prototype had worked too well, it became a threat. So they buried it. Buried him. Not anymore. He reached for the calibration tool and adjusted the input valve. "Carmen," he called over his shoulder. "Run the new cycle." Carmen tapped the control panel. The screen flickered, then glowed steady. Diagnostics flowed like water. Clean, stable, efficient. "Voltage holding," she said. "Thermal levels optimal. Fuel compression." "Perfect." Frank nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. For the first time in 15 years, the machine was alive. But just as the room began to fill with cautious excitement, the emergency lights blinked red. An alert flashed across every terminal. Unauthorized system access detected. Frank stiffened. "Shut it down. Now." Carmen slammed the override. The engine powered down in a hiss of steam. "Where did that come from?" one of the engineers asked. A young tech scanned the logs. "It came from internal systems. Someone tried to push a remote override from Chase's old credentials." Frank's eyes narrowed. He's still watching. That night, Frank stayed in the lab long after the others left. Alone, he dug deeper. Behind every line of code, he found more rot. Fail-safes that weren't his. hidden commands masked in redundant functions. Chase hadn't just tried to bury the engine, he had tried to control it from the shadows. If the launch had succeeded, it wouldn't have been Frank's victory. It would have been a trap. He printed the logs, dozens of pages, then walked them down the hall to the internal legal office. Carmen was waiting. "He's trying to trigger a shutdown," Frank said, handing her the documents. "If we don't sever that control, he'll crash the entire project. Publicly." Carmen flipped through the printouts. "This is enough to file a federal injunction." Frank's voice was calm. "Do it, but do it quietly. We finish the rebuild before the world knows what's coming." For the next 3 days, the lab turned into a war room. Engineers coded through the night, replacing every vulnerable module. Security teams locked down access points. Carmen coordinated with investigators. And Frank? Frank didn't sleep. He rewrote the engine's logic from memory, rebuilding it one command at a time. By the time Friday arrived, the machine was no longer a prototype. It was proof. Proof that he had built it. Proof that they had stolen it. And proof that, even after a decade and a half of betrayal, he was still the only man who could make it run. As the team gathered for the final test, Frank stood in front of the console. The lights dimmed. The air was tense. "This is it," Carmen whispered. Frank nodded, then pressed start. The engine roared to life, smooth, powerful, unbreakable. Everyone in the room erupted in cheers. Some cried. Carmen hugged him hard. And Frank? Frank stood still, eyes closed. It wasn't just a machine. It was his name, his redemption, and his first strike back. Chapter 9. A Name. Restored. The sound of the engine reverberated through the reinforced glass walls of the R&D lab, a deep, confident purr that didn't just signal a mechanical victory, but a personal one. Frank Hughes stood motionless before the console, the hum of his creation vibrating through his chest like a heartbeat he thought had long stopped. Around him, the team watched in awe. Most had only known him as the janitor, the man who emptied their trash and mopped their floors while they typed away on systems he had once designed. But now, their silence was reverent. The respect in their eyes was no longer shallow or performative. It was earned. The engine held steady. No warnings, no overheating, no code failures. Frank exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the console. It was working exactly as it should have all along, before they stole it, before they twisted his work into a weapon of corporate stagnation, before they buried him. Carmen stepped forward, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "It's time." Frank nodded. They made their way into the auditorium, where reporters had already begun gathering after whispers of a breakthrough leaked online. Company PR had been silent, but the buzz couldn't be contained. A once-failed prototype, miraculously revived by a janitor. The story had grown its own legs. The stage lights were hot. A podium stood ready. Behind it, on a massive screen, the company's name glowed in bold blue letters. Reynolds Auto Tech. Frank didn't bother sitting among the suits. Instead, he walked directly to the front, his janitor's uniform still smeared with grease and time. No one stopped him. No one dared. He took the mic. 15 years ago, he began, voice low but unwavering, I stood on a different stage in this very building. I presented a design that could have changed everything, an engine that reduced emissions, cut waste, and outperformed every combustion system on the market. He paused, letting his words settle in the air. But that design never made it to market. My name disappeared from the patents. The project was sabotaged, and I was handed a termination letter and escorted out like a criminal. Murmurs rippled through the audience. I didn't come back for revenge, Frank continued. I came back because the truth deserves daylight, because talent deserves credit, and because integrity, even buried under layers of lies, doesn't die. He turned toward the executives seated stage right, most of them too ashamed to meet his gaze. You didn't just try to erase my name. You tried to erase what it meant. But here's the thing about truth. It echoes. It finds a way back. He turned back to the crowd. And today, it runs. The screen behind him changed. A live feed of the prototype's dashboard showed flawless stats. Performance metrics peaking, heat levels balanced, emissions near zero. It was undeniable. Applause thundered through the auditorium. Some executives tried to save face, clapping along, while others quietly slipped out the side exits, phones pressed to ears in panic. Carmen took the mic next. "Effective immediately," she said. "Frank Hughes is reinstated as Chief Innovation Officer with full rights and equity for every design attributed to the Reynolds X project. Additionally, an internal investigation has been launched into former CEO Chase Reynolds, including his role in patent theft, financial misconduct, and systemic discrimination." The room froze at the name, then erupted. Reporters scrambled. Flashes popped. The scandal had a face now. Frank didn't bask in the chaos. He stepped away from the podium and walked out the back of the stage, past the polished corridors he hadn't walked in years, into the quiet of the rooftop. The city skyline stretched before him. He let the wind hit his face. It wasn't just justice. It was closure. But it wasn't over yet. Inside his pocket, Frank's phone buzzed. A message from an encrypted contact. "They're moving assets, not just here. It's bigger than you think. Call me." Frank's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about a stolen engine. It was about an entire network. And he had just pulled the first thread. Chapter 10. The Hidden Circuit. Frank Hughes stood alone in the lab as the storm outside intensified, sheets of rain tapping against the reinforced windows like fingers demanding to be let in. The celebration from earlier had dispersed, the boardroom emptied, the cameras packed away. But Frank remained, not out of sentiment, out of necessity. He sat at the central workstation, a sleek console that hummed softly with ambient light. In front of him lay a collection of physical blueprints, original copies smuggled out long ago. Some of the diagrams were his, some weren't. But all of them shared one trait: corruption, embedded anomalies, mechanical flaws too subtle for even the best systems to detect. And now, a message burned on the encrypted laptop screen beside him. Project Delta. Active in 3 other facilities. Embedded fail points consistent with Reynolds' prototype. Sabotage not isolated. Trace. Global Frank exhaled slowly, tracing a red-inked circle over a small coil pattern drawn by hand. It was barely perceptible, a half-millimeter shift in pressure tolerance. In a production model, that flaw would never trigger an error until the moment it failed catastrophically. He leaned back in the chair, the worn leather creaking under him. This wasn't just theft. This was weaponized innovation, a controlled chokehold on future technologies. If Reynolds Autotech had implemented these across their other divisions, it meant consumers weren't just buying cars, they were buying time bombs. A knock echoed from the side entrance. Frank turned. Carmen. She entered quickly, shaking rain from her coat. "I had a feeling you'd still be here." He gestured at the screen. "Looks like Reynolds isn't the only dirty shop on the block." Carmen scanned the files, her face tightening with each document. "These specs, they match the suppression patterns I saw at Orion Motors back when I interned there. It's identical sabotage." Frank looked up. "Then it's systemic." She nodded. "And coordinated. Someone's curating failure across competitors. Not enough to crash reputations, but enough to delay progress. Keep us running in circles while they consolidate patents." Frank's jaw clenched. And Chase was just one of the tools. He turned toward the engine model, still humming in the corner of the lab. "This whole time, I thought the betrayal was personal. Turns out it was strategic." Carmen sat beside him. "We could go to the media." "We will," Frank said, "but not yet. If this web runs as deep as I think, we're not dealing with boardroom politics anymore. We're dealing with sabotage engineered on a global scale. We need to follow the money. The shell companies, the off-site labs. Carmen pulled a flash drive from her coat. Then you'll want this. It's a dump from Chase's private server. I made a copy right before the investigation started. NDA violations, payoffs, prototype tampering, and a list of all the engineers who were restructured after contributing too much. Frank took it with reverence. On the screen, one folder caught his eye. Project Ravenna, approved sites. He opened it. Coordinates, factory names, one in Munich, another in Seoul, and a third in Detroit, right under their noses. Frank's voice was a low growl. We start there. Outside, the storm passed, but a new one was building. This time, Frank wouldn't be the janitor cleaning up someone else's mess. This time, he'd burn the machine from the inside. Chapter 11. Detroit. The warehouse in Detroit didn't look like much. From the outside, it was just another relic of the auto industry's golden past. Bricks stained by decades of soot, steel doors that groaned under their own weight, windows clouded with the grime of forgotten ambition. But inside, something new was being built, something hidden. Frank Hughes stood across the street, hoodie drawn over his head, watching. It was just after midnight, the street deserted, the fog rolling in from the river in slow, silken waves. Carmen crouched beside him, tablet in hand, infrared feed glowing faintly in the dark. Multiple heat signatures inside, she whispered. No guards at the front, but 3 around the rear dock. Patterned patrol every 7 minutes. Frank studied the rhythm. Just enough to keep outsiders away, not enough to suggest they expect a breach. She nodded. They feel safe. Good, Frank said. Arrogance leaves gaps. They moved silently, slipping through an alley where the brick wall had crumbled, revealing an old maintenance tunnel. It smelled of rust and mildew, but the silence was perfect. At the end of the passage, a service hatch waited, one Frank had used years ago when this place still bore the Reynolds emblem. Inside, the space had changed. Gone were the outdated tools and manual workbenches. In their place, robotic arms, multi-axis turbines, a suspended testing platform surrounded by chrome consoles and security cameras. At the center of the platform sat a gleaming engine, sleeker than the prototype Frank had worked on, but unmistakably built from the same stolen blueprints. Frank's throat tightened. They scaled it. Carmen moved beside him, scanning, and improved it. Look, new integration nodes, advanced thermal coatings, but the sabotage pattern's still there. This one's designed to detonate at high load. Frank narrowed his eyes. Not an accident. A trigger. Suddenly, voices echoed through the chamber. Footsteps approached. Frank and Carmen ducked behind a stack of crates as 2 figures entered. A tall man in a tailored coat, someone Frank didn't recognize, and another shorter, broader man wearing Reynolds Autotech security insignia. Munich's ready, said the tall one. Korea is behind schedule. We need to accelerate Phase 3. Detroit is stable, the other replied. We can simulate failure within the next 2 weeks, enough to discredit competitors without exposing us. Frank listened, blood boiling. These weren't engineers. They were operatives, and the engine wasn't a breakthrough, it was a weapon. Carmen's eyes met his. We can't just watch this happen. No, Frank said quietly. We stop it now. They waited until the men passed, then slipped forward. Frank approached the main console, fingers dancing over the familiar interface. The core systems were encrypted, but the architecture hadn't changed. He found the critical flaw, the intentional overload protocol, and rewrote it, replacing the self-destruct function with a shutdown loop. He worked quickly, each keystroke undoing years of treachery. Behind him, Carmen copied the server files to her drive, names, accounts, test results, and a spreadsheet of payoffs that led all the way back to Chase Reynolds. A distant shout interrupted them. Intruders! Flashlights cut through the dark, the sound of boots on steel. Frank ripped the drive from the console and grabbed Carmen's hand. Go! They ran, heartbeats hammering in their ears, alarms blaring behind them. Down the catwalk, through the side corridor, up an emergency ladder that led to the rooftop. Wind lashed their faces as they emerged into the open air. Below, cars screeched to a halt. Carmen tapped her earpiece. "I sent the files to the encrypted drop. It's live." Frank nodded. "Then they can't bury it." A floodlight snapped on. A voice through a bullhorn shouted, "Hands up!" Frank turned to her, eyes calm. "Jump!" "What?" "Roof to the next building. 12 feet. You can make it." "And you?" Frank glanced at the edge, calculating. "I've done worse." She looked at him. "You sure?" He didn't answer, just smiled. They ran. Chapter 12. The broadcast rain hit the rooftop like shattered glass as Frank and Carmen landed hard on the adjacent building. Frank rolled, gritting his teeth as pain shot through his shoulder. Carmen helped him up quickly, no time to check injuries. Helicopter rotors sliced through the wind somewhere behind them, the thudding blades echoing across the city skyline. They disappeared into the stairwell, boots pounding the rusted steps, each floor a blur of peeling paint and forgotten tenants. Finally, they reached the basement, just another shadowed corner of Detroit's underbelly. But down here, beneath the decay, was something Frank had planned years ago. A fail-safe. Carmen stared as Frank pulled aside an old locker, revealing a reinforced door. "What is this?" "My insurance policy," he said. "I built it after they erased me, just in case I ever came back." Inside, servers, cables, an off-grid network, and a broadcasting rig patched into a private satellite link. Carmen powered up the system. Frank inserted the drive. The lights blinked to life, green, blue, red, each one carrying fragments of the truth through layers of encrypted relays. On screen, hundreds of documents flickered into view: stolen patents, financial ledgers, blueprints with sabotage markers, internal memos, and videos, footage of Frank's termination, of Chase Reynolds giving the kill order on prototype safety, of secret meetings with foreign contractors planning strategic failures. Carmen's voice shook. "We're about to end them." Frank didn't smile. "Number. We're about to remind them what they did and who they tried to bury." He keyed up the global stream, targeting tech outlets, whistleblower networks, and live feeds with auto-upload redundancies. Carmen linked a webcam. "You ready?" she asked. Frank stepped in front of the lens, still in his janitor's uniform, mop leaning against the wall. He looked directly into the camera. No speech prepared, no theatrics, just truth. "My name is Frank Hughes. I was once an engineer at Reynolds Auto Tech. 15 years ago, I built a new kind of engine. Efficient, powerful, safe. They stole it. Then they sabotaged it. When I found out, they erased me. They made me disappear." His voice stayed level, but his eyes burned. "They made me a janitor in my own house." He stepped aside, letting the evidence fill the screen. "But I never stopped watching. And now, you can see for yourself." Across the world, screens lit up. Laptops in cafes, phones in pockets, terminals in newsrooms. Hashtags ignited, forums exploded, and inside Reynolds HQ, the command room descended into chaos as executives realized their firewalls had failed. Chase Reynolds stood frozen, eyes locked on the live stream. The old man he thought he'd destroyed now beaming into every corner of the digital world. "Cut it!" Chase barked. "Get legal! Get PR! Get the goddamn feds!" But it was too late. The data was out. In the basement, Frank collapsed into a chair, breathing heavy, eyes closed. "It's done," Carmen whispered. Frank didn't answer. He just stared at his hands, hands that once shaped the future, then were used to scrub its floors. Tonight, they'd done both. Sirens wailed in the distance, but he didn't flinch. He had told the world, and the world had listened. Chapter 13. Fallout. The morning after the broadcast, Reynolds Auto Tech woke up to fire. Not literal flames, but a digital inferno. Headlines scrolled across every major news outlet. Whistleblower exposes corporate sabotage at Reynolds Auto Tech. Frank Hughes' name, once erased from patents and project archives, now blazed across screens and social media feeds. Engineers in Silicon Valley shared his story. Factory workers in Germany passed it around during break. Even mainstream networks opened their segments with clips of the old janitor calling out betrayal in the cold tone of truth. Chase Reynolds didn't sleep. Not after the leaks. Not after the board called an emergency meeting at 3 a.m. to demand answers. Not after several nations halted pending contracts with Reynolds due to possible product integrity violations. And definitely not after federal agents showed up at his front gate with a search warrant. He paced the glass halls of his private suite, surrounded by attorneys who spoke in legal code he barely heard. Phrases like criminal negligence, international fraud, economic endangerment. His fortune trembled under the weight of the disclosures, and he knew it was only beginning. But the worst blow came not from the outside world, it came from within. The board of directors issued a statement by noon. Chase Reynolds had been suspended, pending full investigation. Stockholders demanded transparency. Share values plummeted by double digits. Shareholders who once toasted to his arrogance now turned away in silence. Meanwhile, Frank stood in the shadows of a different kind of storm. He watched the headlines from a distance, sitting on a park bench under the autumn haze. His janitor uniform was gone. So was the mop. In its place, a quiet coat, worn shoes, and a stillness earned through years of survival. Carmen sat beside him, tablet in her lap, skimming article after article. "They're calling you the last engineer," she said softly. Frank huffed, eyes scanning a child chasing pigeons across the path. "Catchy," she turned toward him. "The Senate wants you to testify." "I'm not interested in politics." "It's not about politics," she said. "It's about legacy." Frank didn't respond. Legacy? What legacy? His past had been taken from him, burned and buried, then twisted into corporate propaganda. And now that the world finally knew, it wasn't triumph he felt. It was exhaustion. "You should rest," Carmen offered. Frank nodded slowly, but he didn't move, because inside him, something remained unfinished. That engine, the one they built to fail, was still operational. Its data still hidden in dark corners of servers untouched. The sabotage network still intact in other subsidiaries Reynolds had quietly created abroad. "This was never just about one engine," he finally said. "It's a pattern, a system." Carmen frowned. "You want to go deeper?" Frank looked toward the horizon. "I want to end it." He stood up, the ache in his knees reminding him of every year spent in silence. Carmen followed. They walked together, not as fugitives, not as whistleblowers, but as a force built from endurance and truth. And somewhere, deep in a corner of a corrupted empire, systems still blinked, engines still whirred, files remained, waiting for someone to pull the plug. Frank wasn't finished. Not yet. Chapter 14. The Deep Core. The elevator descended slower than Frank remembered. Beneath Reynolds Auto Tech HQ was a level unknown to most employees, a buried sub-basement called Core Unit 0. It had no floor label, no signage, just biometric access and a silence built for secrets. Carmen adjusted her satchel, the blueprints tucked safely inside. She'd decrypted the locations of every foreign lab Reynolds had funneled its sabotage program through. But the nerve center, the real rot, was still here, under the building they once called the heart of American innovation. As the elevator doors opened, a gust of recycled air blew through the narrow corridor, concrete walls, red lights blinking softly from surveillance cameras. At the end of the hallway stood a vault-style door with a recessed terminal. Frank stepped forward and placed his hand on the scanner. It beeped once, then paused. Carmen held her breath, then a green light. Access granted. 15 years ago, before he was erased, Frank had designed the internal override codes for the lab, and though Chase had tried to lock him out forever, some ghosts refused to be buried. Inside, rows of servers hummed in the darkness. The walls were lined with prototype schematics, designs for engines, battery systems, control modules. But as they moved deeper, the air changed. The clutter of innovation gave way to something colder. "This is it," Carmen said, eyes scanning a central terminal. Frank approached it. On the screen, a list of active systems appeared. Project Scorch, Echo Drive Collapse, Revenue Spike, Fail-Safe Override. He scrolled further. Each name was a code for intentional failure embedded into products, designed to break, to sabotage competitors, to drive repeated sales, to silence engineers like him. He inserted the second drive. The screen flickered. Access opened. Carmen initiated the extraction script. Bit by bit, the data flowed. Then, an alert. Intrusion detected. The door behind them slammed shut. Red alarms spun in the corners. "We've got company," Carmen muttered. From a side entrance, 2 armed guards stormed in. Private contractors, not police. Their suits had no insignias, just earpieces and cold eyes. "Hands in the air," one barked. Frank didn't flinch. He raised his hands slowly. "We're just cleaning up," he said with a smirk. The second guard advanced, but Carmen moved faster. With a flick of her wrist, she launched a blinding flash from her pocket. The men stumbled, shouting. Frank grabbed a wrench from the floor, swung once, clean. One man dropped. The other tried to fire. Too late. Carmen tackled him to the ground. Silence returned, broken only by the download's steady pulse. When the last file synced, Frank turned to the central control. "There's one more thing," he said. He activated the fail-safe purge, a full system collapse. Within seconds, the internal sabotage network began to self-delete. All remote access points burned, all triggers neutralized. Chase Reynolds couldn't use it anymore. No one could. The screen went black. The lab went silent. Then Frank reached into his coat and pulled out the old blueprint, the first engine design he'd ever drawn. He placed it gently on the workstation. "My legacy," he whispered. "Not theirs." They exited through the rear service shaft. Outside, the city was waking up. News outlets were already reporting arrests at Reynolds's foreign subsidiaries. The Senate was calling for hearings. International watchdogs demanded accountability. But for Frank, justice wasn't in headlines. It was in the absence of corruption. He and Carmen stood in the sunlight, free, finally, from the weight of what had been stolen. And in that moment, the man once called Janitor was something else again. Engineer, architect, witness, and survivor. Chapter 15. Redemption Engine. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the aisles, their cameras blinking like impatient eyes. Senators whispered behind folded folders. Screens mounted across the hall played footage of Reynolds Auto Tech's crimes, manipulated diagnostics, engineered failures, whistleblower testimonies. And at the center of it all, called to the witness stand with the weight of a stolen past on his shoulders, stood Frank Hughes. He wore no suit. Just a clean shirt, plain slacks, and the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. "My name is Frank Hughes," he began, voice steady, calm. 15 years ago, I helped design an engine that could have redefined the future. Then I was fired, not because I failed, but because I asked too many questions." He paused, scanning the room. There were no hostile glares anymore, only silence and the gravity of truth. "I watched as my work was weaponized, my designs rewritten, not to build better engines but to break them, so people would keep buying, so the company could profit off collapse." Every word landed like a hammer. Chase Reynolds seated behind his legal team, shifted uncomfortably. The once proud CEO now looked smaller, paler, defanged. Frank continued. I swept those floors for 15 years, not because I had no skills, but because they wanted me erased. And I stayed. Because I was waiting for the moment when silence would no longer protect them. Carmen watched from the side, her hand clenched into a fist. She had helped bring the truth to light. But it was Frank who gave it meaning. That day, the committee moved quickly. Subpoenas, seizures. The Department of Justice launched an immediate indictment. Chase Reynolds was arrested the same evening, escorted in cuffs from his penthouse, while investors scrambled to salvage the wreckage of his empire. But justice wasn't just legal, it was personal. Weeks later, Frank stood at the gates of the old factory one last time. The place was shuttered. Operations had halted, workers laid off, lawsuits piling up, a shell of what once was a titan. But Frank wasn't there to mourn it. He walked through the corridors, now dark, empty. In his hand was a set of blueprints. Not old ones, new. In partnership with an independent startup, Frank had been offered full control of a new R&D facility. A clean slate. A place where ideas wouldn't be stolen. Where engineers of all backgrounds could innovate freely without fear of erasure. He entered the old workshop floor and knelt beside the same spot where he once dropped his mop. He smiled, then opened the blueprint. Redemption Engine, Gen 1. A clean design, efficient, scalable, affordable. Built not for planned obsolescence, but for endurance. He stood up and looked out the window. The sun was rising through the glass, scattering gold across the dusty metal. Frank Hughes had walked through the fire, and now at last he would build without chains. He was no longer a janitor. He was the last engineer.